The oldest rivalry in continental Europe is between France and Germany. It traces all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The unification of German areas, excluding Austria, led to a feeling that Germany was becoming the dominant power in Europe. In the Franco-Prussian War, the French were comprehensively defeated, and in fact, two French territories, Alsace and Lorraine, they were taken over by the Germans. This was a lingering feeling among the French elite until at least World War I. And of course, in World War I, the Allied forces won. France was able to regain the lost territories. In the Second World War II, France and Germany found themselves on opposite sides. Eventually, at the end of World War II and the years later, both France and Germany joined NATO and later the European Economic Community. Today, they are the biggest and the second biggest economies in Europe. They are the fulcrum of continental Europe. But those old wounds between France and Germany, the Franco-German rivalry, it's being revived yet again today, thanks to one man, Vladimir Putin, and his special military operation in Ukraine. On Crux Decode, has Putin's war divided two of Europe's biggest powers? Does France want a more conciliatory approach to Russia? Will Macron's call for a new Europe exclude Germany? And are the Germans more worried about the cost of this war more than anything else? Last month, Europe's second biggest country, France, was on the edge as the incumbent centrist president, Emmanuel Macron, was seeking a second term. He was up against the far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen. Her plan was a complete subversion of the idea of France as we know it, to make France into an autarkic, nationalist country. A country that is less integrated with Europe, more insular, and more inward-looking. But that was not the only reason. In fact, the very future of Europe's response to Russia's war and Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine also hinged on the French election. Le Pen was openly ready to partner with Russia. Macron would have none of it. Eventually, Macron won the election and he won it big. And the echoes of his victory are being felt far outside Paris, because the very capacity of the European Union to drive forward both internally and externally, so crucial given the mountainous challenges facing the continent right now, would have collapsed had Macron lost and Le Pen won. So would the cohesion of the West in its response to Putin's war. Macron may have won the election hands down, but it is also the closest that the far right has so far come in France to winning the presidency. EU pessimists are also worried that the European Union may not be safe for too long. Whether we're talking about inflation, the cost of living, weaning Europe of Russian energy dependence, holding a common line against Vladimir Putin, or simply protecting European values against right-wing populists, the EU is right now facing some of the most formidable challenges since the Second World War. And the worst part is that EU institutions seem to be hardly equipped to deal with these challenges. Meanwhile, Macron is constitutionally forbidden from standing again for election for a third term in 2027. Now, with the collapse of the traditional parties, the Republican left and the right parties, a Le Pen win, or somebody who succeeds her, perhaps a more charismatic successor, who would face an opponent who has less swagger than Macron, might have a real chance of winning the French presidency 5 years later. Now, much of French politics depends on whether France's improving economic performance follows through to show benefits that are visible on the ground, and whether the European Union is seen more as a source of strength and not as a source of weakness. So Macron is now doubling down in his second term. He's called for a new political organization to unite democracies on the European continent. He's also warned that Ukraine would probably not join the EU for several decades. Now, this is causing some consternation amongst EU backers. Speaking just a couple of days after being sworn in for his second term as French President, Macron called for big thinking on the future of Europe. He also went on to say that the war in Ukraine showed the need for a historic process of reflection. Now, here's what Macron proposed: a European political community, a new European organization which would enable democratic European nations to adhere to shared values. Macron's intervention comes even as the EU is clashing on how quickly they can move forward with Kiev's membership application. Now, this question is likely to reach a crunch point in June, when European Union leaders will meet to decide whether to grant Ukraine candidate status, and if they do, that is a procedural step that's going to take years to attain. And if the EU is seen as dithering on Ukraine's membership, then it could only further embolden Vladimir Putin. But Macron, in his speech, did not stop just there. He warned against any kind of punitive reaction, a punitive settlement vis-à-vis Russia once this war is over. He said, and I quote, "When peace returns to European soil, we will have to build a new security balance, and together we must never give in to the temptation or the desire for revenge, because we know how much that has ravished the road to the peace in the past." Now, a newly elected Macron will need the unflinching support of Germany, the largest economy in Europe. But Germany itself, for all its deeply held pro-European convictions, is beset by a number of its own problems and tensions. Bild Zeitung, which is Germany's best-selling right-wing tabloid, has labeled Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, as Madame Inflation. Eurozone inflation has hit 7.5%. That's a record high. German inflation has not been this high for more than 70 years since the end of World War II. In fact, if you remember, it was hyperinflation back in the 1920s that opened the door to Adolf Hitler. Other Europeans may admire the success of liberal capitalism and democracy in post-war Germany, but Germans themselves are skeptical. They're worried that the gains that they've made over the last 70 years are precarious, and some of the old demons could easily be stirred. Last May, Olaf Scholz, the then German finance minister and now the Chancellor of Germany, he hailed the just-launched ambitious EU COVID recovery plan. He called it Europe's Hamilton moment. EU member states would guarantee the issue of EU bonds on an unprecedented scale. This will in turn finance investment in green and digital technologies. Now, this was similar to America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who pioneered the federal government's guarantee of state debt to cement the newly created United States of America. Macron, who had fought hard for the fund, was equally delighted when Scholz made the announcement. The EU had shown its mettle, a certain Rubicon had been crossed. But the Ukraine war and the epic inflation that we're seeing right now are shaking Germany to its very core. Now the country has to navigate the exceptional cost of weaning itself of Russian oil and gas. Till before the war began, Germany depended up to 40% for its gas on Russian exports. Now, since the war began, Germany has already bought more than $10 billion of oil and gas from Russia. Germany wants a phased ban on Russian oil and gas. Its economy minister, in fact, Robert Habeck, has warned that if there were to be a sudden or even a phased-out stoppage of Russian oil and gas imports, then that would create, according to him, mass unemployment, poverty, people who cannot heat their homes, and the country itself would simply run out of petrol. But even the phased Russian ban is risking a German recession and a squeeze on living standards. Germany must simultaneously fund its own energy transition as well as a vast defense build-up. In fact, it is just announced, after the war was announced, it just came out with a $100 billion military modernization fund since the beginning of the war. Its appetite for more big-ticket initiatives will be limited as long as inflation is high and the finances are really cramped. So all of this means that the prospect of the rise of right-wing populism in mainland Europe looks all too real. What is impressive, though, about the EU is that unlike the United States or the UK for that matter, the center of gravity in Europe seems to be holding up. The mainstream French and German political classes, along with those in Spain, Italy, Holland, and beyond, they know that the European Union is a crucial bulwark, and they have no choice but to stand by it.